Marcus Thompson was 34 years old and had been living in his 15-year-old Honda Civic for 7 months when he started parking regularly behind Giuseppe's Italian restaurant in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle, choosing the restaurant's back parking lot because it had a dumpster where he could occasionally find discarded food that was still edible, and because the alley provided some shelter from Seattle's constant rain, and because the restaurant's owner didn't immediately call the police or tow his car like the owners of other businesses had done when they discovered him sleeping in their parking areas. And Marcus would sit in his car during the long empty hours between sunset and dawn, trying to manage the crushing combination of PTSD flashbacks and addiction cravings and bone-deep exhaustion and the humiliation of being a United States Army combat veteran who'd served 2 tours in Iraq and had somehow ended up homeless and hungry and completely alone at age 30. For when he'd imagined his life would look entirely different by now. Marcus had enlisted in the Army at age 18 immediately after high school graduation in his hometown of Tacoma, Washington, had been motivated partly by genuine patriotism and partly by the practical reality that his single mother worked 2 minimum-wage jobs and couldn't afford to help him with college, and the military offered education benefits and job training and a clear path forward for working-class kids who didn't have many other options. He'd completed basic training at Fort Benning and had scored well enough on aptitude tests to be assigned to an infantry unit, and he'd deployed to Iraq for his first tour when he was 19 years old, spending 13 months in Ramadi during some of the heaviest urban combat of the entire war. And he'd seen and done things that had fundamentally changed him in ways he hadn't fully understood at the time, but that had slowly poisoned his ability to function normally in civilian life. He'd returned from his first deployment with what the Army had diagnosed as moderate PTSD, had been given some basic counseling and medication, and had been told he was fit for continued service, and he deployed again to Iraq for a second tour when he was 22. This time to Mosul for another year of combat operations that had included multiple firefights and IED explosions and the deaths of 3 soldiers from his unit, including his closest friend, and when Marcus had finally returned to the United States at age 23 after 4 years total military service, including 2 combat tours, he'd been a completely different person than the optimistic 18-year-old who'd enlisted believing that military service would give him discipline and purpose and valuable skills that would translate into civilian success. The transition to civilian life had been catastrophically difficult in ways the Army's brief transition assistance program hadn't prepared him for. Marcus had separated from military service with an honorable discharge and had enrolled at a community college in Seattle using his GI Bill education benefits, planning to study business management or maybe culinary arts because he'd discovered during his military service that he enjoyed cooking and had occasionally worked in the base kitchen when he wasn't deployed. But he'd found himself unable to concentrate in classes or complete assignments because his PTSD symptoms had worsened. Significantly, once he no longer had the structure and purpose of military service to organize his days, and he'd started missing classes and eventually had stopped attending entirely. He'd tried working various jobs, warehouse positions, security guard work, retail stocking, but he'd struggled with authority figures who'd never served in the military and who he perceived as incompetent or disrespectful, and he'd had difficulty with the monotony and meaninglessness of civilian work after years of high-stakes military operations. And he'd been fired from multiple positions for showing up late or for conflict with supervisors or for what employers had described as inappropriate aggressive behavior that Marcus had experienced as normal assertiveness. He'd started drinking heavily to manage his PTSD symptoms, and his growing sense of failure and disconnection had progressed from beer to hard liquor and had begun combining alcohol with prescription pain medication he'd been given for service-related back pain, and the combination had spiraled quickly into full addiction. 2 years after leaving military service, Marcus had been evicted from his apartment for non-payment of rent after losing yet another job, and he'd moved in with his mother temporarily, but she'd been struggling financially herself and had told him after 3 months that he needed to find his own place because she couldn't afford to support them both. Marcus had tried staying with various friends from high school, but had worn out every welcome through his drinking and his volatile moods and his inability to contribute financially or help with household responsibilities. And eventually he'd found himself sleeping in his car, the 15-year-old Honda Civic his mother had helped him buy when he'd first returned from Iraq. Now, the only possession he had left besides a backpack containing some clothes and his military discharge papers and a few photographs from before everything had fallen apart. The first few months of homelessness had been a blur of survival logistics. Finding safe places to park overnight without being harassed by police, figuring out which public restrooms were accessible for washing up, identifying free meal programs at churches and shelters, managing his addiction with whatever money he could scrape together from occasional day labor or panhandling, avoiding the dangers of street life, including theft and violence, and the constant threat of having his car towed or impounded, which would leave him with literally nothing. He'd tried multiple times to access VA services for his PTSD and addiction, but the nearest VA facility had a 3-month waiting list for mental health appointments, and the emergency services were overwhelmed, and the bureaucracy was deliberately complicated, and Marcus had found himself unable to navigate the system consistently enough to actually receive sustained help. 7 months into homelessness, Marcus had been parking regularly behind Giuseppe's Italian restaurant in Fremont, usually arriving late evening after the restaurant had closed and leaving early morning before the staff arrived to begin prep work for lunch service. He'd chosen the location carefully. The back parking lot wasn't visible from the street. The dumpster area was partially enclosed, providing some privacy and shelter from weather, and most importantly, the restaurant's owner, a middle-aged Italian-American man named Frank Deluca, who Marcus had glimpsed occasionally taking out trash or smoking a cigarette behind the building, hadn't called the police or towing company during the first 2 weeks Marcus had been parking there, which suggested either Frank hadn't noticed or had chosen not to make an issue of it. What Marcus didn't know was that Frank had noticed him immediately on the first night Marcus had parked there, because Frank arrived at the restaurant every morning at 5:30 a.m. to begin prep work and had seen the older Honda with someone sleeping in the back seat. And Frank had approached the car cautiously that first morning and had seen through the slightly fogged windows a young man who looked to be in his 30s sleeping in what was clearly a permanent living situation based on the backpack and blankets and the way the car's interior was organized for habitation rather than just temporary rest. And Frank had noticed the military tattoo visible on the sleeping man's forearm, an Army infantry insignia that Frank had recognized immediately because he himself was a Marine Corps veteran who'd served in the First Gulf War over 20 years earlier. Frank had made a decision in that moment to not disturb the sleeping veteran, had walked back into his restaurant without waking Marcus or calling authorities. But he'd paid attention over the following days and had observed that the young man in the car appeared to be struggling with what Frank suspected was PTSD based on his own experience and his familiarity with how combat veterans often carried themselves. And Frank had also noticed that Marcus seemed to be carefully managing his presence to avoid causing problems, parking only after closing, leaving before opening, not littering or making noise or doing anything that would create issues for the restaurant. After 2 weeks of observing Marcus park behind his restaurant, Frank had made a decision to approach him directly. He'd arrived one morning and had knocked gently on the car window, and when Marcus had woken with the startled, hyper-vigilant reaction of someone who'd learned to sleep ready for danger, Frank had stepped back with his hands visible and had said through the glass that he wasn't calling police and wasn't asking Marcus to leave, but wanted to talk for a minute if Marcus was willing. Marcus had gotten out of the car cautiously, had stood in the cold morning air wearing wrinkled clothes he'd slept in, and had waited for whatever was coming. And Frank had asked directly if Marcus was a veteran, and when Marcus had confirmed that he'd served in the Army in Iraq. Frank had told him that he himself was a Marine who'd served in the First Gulf War, and that he'd noticed the infantry tattoo, and wanted to know if Marcus needed help. The conversation had been brief and awkward because Marcus had been suspicious of offers of help after months of broken promises and bureaucratic failures, and because years of PTSD and addiction had made him defensive and closed off. But Frank had been direct and practical rather than pitying or condescending. Had asked if Marcus was hungry, and when Marcus had admitted he hadn't eaten in 2 days, Frank had told him to come inside the restaurant and had made him a plate of leftover pasta and bread. And they'd sat in the empty dining room while Marcus ate, and Frank had explained that he knew something about how difficult transition to civilian life could be and how the VA system often failed veterans who needed help. Frank had offered Marcus a job washing dishes at the restaurant. Minimum wage plus 1 meal per shift, no questions about employment history or background checks or drug tests. Just an opportunity to work and earn some money and have a place to be during daytime hours instead of sitting in his car with nothing to do but spiral in his thoughts. Marcus had wanted to refuse because accepting felt like admitting how far he'd fallen, and because he'd failed at so many jobs already and didn't want to fail again. But he'd also recognized that he desperately needed exactly what Frank was offering, and he'd accepted with a mumbled thanks that had felt inadequate, but was all he could manage. Marcus had started washing dishes the next day, showing up at 5:30 a.m. when Frank arrived to begin prep work. And the first week had been brutally difficult because his hands weren't used to the hot water and harsh soap and constant motion, and because standing for 8-hour shifts made his service-damaged back ache intensely, and because being around other people after months of isolation triggered his hypervigilance and made him jumpy and irritable. But Frank had been patient and had given him space and had told the other kitchen staff that Marcus was a veteran adjusting to a new job and to give him time to settle in. The restaurant's head chef, a 60-year-old Mexican immigrant named Carlos who'd been cooking professionally for 40 years, had noticed during the second week that Marcus watched the cooking process with interest during slow moments. And Carlos had started explaining occasionally what he was doing and why, had shown Marcus how to properly chop vegetables and how to prepare basic sauces and how different cooking techniques affected flavors and textures, and Marcus had found himself genuinely interested and focused for the first time in years, had discovered that the systematic precision of cooking and the immediate tangible results were satisfying in ways that nothing else in his civilian life had been. 3 months after starting as a dishwasher, Marcus had stopped drinking completely, not through any formal treatment program, but simply because he'd needed to be sober and focused for work, and because having purpose and structure had reduced his need for the numbing effect of alcohol. And Frank had noticed the change and had quietly increased Marcus's hours and had started teaching him basic prep work tasks. And Carlos had begun actively training him in cooking techniques during slower afternoon hours between lunch and dinner service. Marcus was still living in his car behind the restaurant, but Frank had started allowing him to use the restaurant's bathroom to shower after closing and had given him a key to the back door, so he could access the facilities whenever he needed, and had occasionally left food for Marcus in the walk-in refrigerator with a note saying it was about to go bad and Marcus should take it so it wouldn't be wasted. 6 months after starting at Giuseppe's, Marcus had moved from dishwasher to prep cook, had learned to execute many of the fundamental techniques that made the restaurant's Italian cuisine work, and Frank had given him a small raise and had helped him save money by paying him partially in cash that wouldn't be immediately consumed by addiction or bureaucratic obligations. Carlos had told Frank that Marcus had natural cooking talent and good instincts and could potentially develop into a skilled line cook if he continued progressing, and Frank had agreed and had started thinking about how to help Marcus transition from just surviving to actually building a sustainable future. 9 months after Marcus had first started parking behind the restaurant, Frank had approached him about helping to find more permanent housing, had connected Marcus with a veterans housing program that Frank had researched specifically and that had shorter waiting lists than the VA's overwhelmed system, and had offered to provide references and help with application paperwork. Marcus had been hesitant because years of homelessness and bureaucratic failures had taught him not to trust systems or promises, but Frank had been persistent and practical, and 6 weeks later Marcus had moved into a small studio apartment in a building specifically for veterans transitioning out of homelessness, rent subsidized through a combination of VA benefits and nonprofit support. Having stable housing had changed Marcus's life in ways he hadn't anticipated. He could sleep through the night without constant hypervigilance about safety, could shower and do laundry regularly, could cook simple meals instead of relying entirely on restaurant food and occasional dumpster finds, and most importantly, could begin rebuilding some sense of dignity and normalcy that had been completely absent during the months of living in his car. His PTSD symptoms hadn't disappeared, but had become more manageable with stable sleep and reduced stress, and he'd finally been able to navigate the VA bureaucracy enough to start regular therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in combat trauma. 1 year after starting at Giuseppe's restaurant, Marcus had advanced to line cook position, was being trusted to execute complex dishes during busy dinner services, and was earning enough money to cover his rent and food and basic expenses with small amounts left over for savings. Frank had helped him enroll in a community college culinary program using his remaining GI Bill benefits, classes that met during afternoon hours when the restaurant was slow and that taught formal techniques to complement the practical skills Carlos had been training him in, and Marcus had found himself genuinely excited about learning and building towards something for the first time since before his military service. 18 months after first parking behind the restaurant, Marcus had been promoted to sous chef position at Giuseppe's, second in command of the kitchen under Carlos, who was preparing to retire and who'd told Frank that Marcus had developed into an excellent cook with strong technical skills and good leadership potential despite his relatively limited formal training. Frank had given Marcus another raise and had started involving him in menu planning and supplier relationships and the business aspects of running a restaurant kitchen, recognizing that Marcus's military leadership experience combined with his developing culinary skills could potentially make him an effective head chef eventually. 2 years after Frank had first knocked on Marcus's car window, Carlos had retired and Marcus had been promoted to head chef at Giuseppe's, responsible for managing a kitchen staff of 6 people and creating seasonal menu variations and maintaining the quality standards that had made the restaurant successful for 15 years. Marcus had been initially overwhelmed by the responsibility and had struggled with the management aspects of the position because his PTSD still made interpersonal conflict difficult and because he doubted his own capabilities after years of failure and addiction. But Frank had mentored him patiently and had gradually helped him develop confidence in his skills and judgment. Marcus had also become involved in a local organization that helped homeless veterans access services and housing, had started volunteering several hours weekly to share his experience and help other veterans navigate the bureaucracy and isolation that he'd barely survived himself, and had found that helping others who were struggling in the ways he'd struggled gave him additional purpose beyond just his own survival and success. He'd reconnected with his mother, who he'd avoided during the worst period of his homelessness out of shame, and they'd begun slowly rebuilding their relationship, and she'd told him during an emotional conversation that she'd always believed he would eventually find his way back, but had been terrified he wouldn't survive long enough to do it. 3 years after starting at Giuseppe's, Marcus had saved enough money to make a down payment on a used food truck that he'd renovated and equipped with help from Frank and several other veterans he'd met through the Homeless Services Organization, and he'd started operating the truck part-time on weekends, serving simple, high-quality Italian-inspired food at farmers markets and outside breweries and at events. And he'd made a decision to dedicate a portion of his food truck's revenue to providing free meals to homeless veterans at local shelters because he remembered vividly what it had felt like to be hungry and alone and had wanted to offer something tangible to people currently experiencing what he'd experienced. The food truck had been named Second Deployment, a reference to Marcus's military service, but also to the concept of getting a second chance after the first attempt at civilian life had failed catastrophically, and the truck had attracted attention both for its food quality and for its mission of hiring and feeding homeless veterans. And local media had covered Marcus's story several times, highlighting the journey from living in a car behind a restaurant to running his own small business, while still working as head chef at Giuseppe's and volunteering with Veterans Services. For years after Frank had first approached his car, Marcus had hired 3 other homeless veterans to work part-time on the food truck, had provided them with the same combination of employment and dignity and patient mentoring that Frank had given him, and had watched 2 of them successfully transition into stable housing and sustained employment, while the third was still struggling, but making slow progress. Marcus had also begun speaking occasionally at VA facilities and veterans organizations about PTSD and addiction and homelessness, sharing his experience not as someone who'd overcome everything perfectly, but rather as someone who'd survived through a combination of his own stubborn persistence and the intervention of a fellow veteran who'd chosen to help rather than ignore. Frank had told Marcus many times that he hadn't done anything special, that helping a fellow veteran who was struggling was just basic human decency and military brotherhood. But Marcus had understood that Frank's intervention had literally saved his life, because without the job and the patient support and the gradual rebuilding of purpose and structure, Marcus would almost certainly have died on the streets from addiction or violence, or simply from the slow, grinding destruction of homelessness. The difference between Marcus dying in his car at age 34 and Marcus becoming a successful chef and food truck owner and advocate for homeless veterans had been one restaurant owner choosing to knock on a car window and offer help instead of calling the police, choosing to see a struggling fellow veteran instead of just an inconvenient homeless person taking up parking space. Marcus Thompson's story reminds us that he was 34 years old and living in his 15-year-old Honda Civic, parking behind Giuseppe's Italian restaurant in Seattle, a homeless Iraq War veteran surviving on dumpster food and managing PTSD flashbacks and addiction after 2 combat tours and a catastrophic failure to transition to civilian life. And he would likely have died there if the restaurant owner Frank Deluca hadn't recognized the Army infantry tattoo on Marcus's arm and chosen to help a fellow veteran instead of calling the police. 22 veterans die by suicide daily in America. 40,000 veterans are homeless on any given night. Marcus had served 2 tours in Iraq, Ramadi and Mosul, heavy urban combat, watched friends die, came home with severe PTSD at age 23. The Army's transition program prepared him for nothing. He tried college, couldn't concentrate, tried jobs, got fired for PTSD symptoms employers called inappropriate aggression, started drinking to manage flashbacks, lost his apartment, wore out his welcome with friends and family, ended up in his car at 34, 7 months homeless, struggling to survive. Frank Deluca was a Marine Gulf War veteran who owned Giuseppe's restaurant. He noticed Marcus sleeping in the parking lot, saw the military tattoo, recognized a fellow veteran in crisis. Instead of calling police or towing the car, Frank approached Marcus directly, offered him dishwashing work for minimum wage plus meals, no background check, no judgment, just employment and dignity. Marcus started washing dishes, then prep cooking. Carlos, the head chef, taught him techniques. 3 months later, Marcus had stopped drinking. 6 months later, he'd moved from dishwasher to prep cook. 9 months later, Frank helped him access veterans housing. 1 year later, Marcus was a line cook enrolled in culinary school. 18 months later, sous chef. 2 years later, head chef when Carlos retired. 3 years after living in his car, Marcus owned a food truck called Second Deployment, serving Italian food and providing free meals to homeless veterans. He hired other homeless vets, helped them transition to housing like Frank had helped him. For years later, Marcus was speaking at VA facilities about PTSD and homelessness, running his food truck, still working as head chef at Giuseppe's, advocating for veteran services. Frank's intervention, knocking on a car window, offering a job, treating Marcus with dignity, saved Marcus's life. Military brotherhood extended beyond service into civilian crisis. Frank saw what employers and bureaucrats hadn't: a capable person temporarily destroyed by systems that failed veterans. Employment plus patience plus purpose equaled recovery. Not instant, not perfect, but sustainable. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe veterans deserve support beyond "thank you for your service." Join the conversation. Have you or veteran family struggled with PTSD, homelessness, or transition to civilian life? Share below. Remember, Marcus wasn't weak or lazy. He served 2 combat tours, watched friends die, developed PTSD the military didn't adequately treat. Veteran homelessness isn't individual failure. It's systemic abandonment of people who serve. Support veteran housing programs. Support PTSD treatment. Support veteran employment initiatives.